Hey everybody, this is Glenn Greenwald, and this is the first live stream of System Update. We're starting it now prior to airing my discussions with Benjamin Dixon and Briahna Joy Gray, the former press secretary of the Sanders campaign, because we're having a little bit of a technical difficulty. The Sanders campaign, because we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. The interviews, but they will be up very shortly. So we decided to start the live discussion now. And the idea of it is to have a discussion where I can answer questions from viewers that are in the chats about the topics that I was discussing with both Briahna and Ben Dixon, namely what is the proper relationship between Sanders supporters and the left on the one hand and the Biden candidacy on the other. Bernie Sanders came out yesterday and announced on a live stream with Joe Biden that he would be endorsing Biden's candidacy without extracting any public concessions that we know about, and urged his supporters to do the same. And yet many of his prominent supporters, including his own campaign press secretary, Briahna Joy Gray, announced that, at least in her case, she has no intention of endorsing Biden. And so I talked to her about the reasons why. And I also talked to Benjamin Dixon, who was a very vocal supporter of the Sanders campaign, regarding his views of whether Sanders supporters ought to be supporting Biden, what his view on that calculus is as well. So I'm happy to take questions about that topic or really anything else that might be on your mind, and we can have a live chat. It's sort of experimental, given that we've never done it before here on System Update, or I think maybe even on the Intercept, although I think there have been live chats between people on the Intercept. And then we can broadcast those interviews once they're ready, and then maybe have another live chat again. So I'm now looking at the chats, and I see a lot of people who seem to be expressing surprise that President Obama played such a critical role in consolidating the entire Democratic Party to get behind Joe Biden, behind the scenes, engineering Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar to drop out, which is what a lot of people speculated. There was a new New York Times article this morning that described in new detail what it is exactly that Obama did, including encouraging Pete Buttigieg to use what he called his maximum leverage that he would have prior to Super Tuesday. And then there are a lot of other people who are surprised with the aggression with which Bernie is supporting Biden. And I don't think we should be surprised about either of those. For one thing, when you talk about establishments, what establishments do is they use their power to ensure that they maintain a stranglehold on power. And I think it was always inevitable that the Democratic Party establishment was going to unite behind a single establishment alternative to Bernie. They watched in 2016 the Republicans who were incapable of doing that, which is why Trump was able to win over a divided field. But the Democrats, despite accusing Republicans of being cult-like and highly disciplined, are actually far more disciplined and are much more susceptible to following the leader than Republicans are. The speed with which they all snapped into line after South Carolina behind Biden, a highly flawed candidate, both politically and electorally, was really not just impressive, but creepy. But that is what establishments do. And if you want to run an insurgent candidacy and remove power from their hands, you need to anticipate those tactics. That's how establishments behave. I think we also should be completely unsurprised that Bernie is endorsing Biden, not just endorsing him the way he endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2016, but doing it with such fervor. Bernie, for one thing, always said that he would endorse the Democratic Party nominee. I think it was important to take him at his word. This is what he said he would do, and now he's doing it. But I also think there's this tension, and we explored this in the last program of System Update, or the first one rather, that I did with Kyle Kulinski and Liz Franzik, about what is this intrinsic tension between, on the one hand, saying that, and then on the other hand, doing it behind a candidate who has actually spent decades in Washington, working very collegially with the very people who lead the establishment that you claim you're trying to overthrow. It is clear that, in stark contrast to the way Donald Trump hated, or at least was willing to do a scorched earth campaign against Republican establishment leaders in 2016, speaking viciously about Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and then Ted Cruz, whatever power center tried to impede his path to the nomination. Bernie was the opposite. He was completely unwilling to do any of that. In fact, he punished his campaign staff for going over what he regarded as the line in criticizing Joe Biden, which was a very restrictive line. They were not able to talk about Biden's electability problems. They weren't permitted to talk about the allegations of sexual assault and sexual harassment that he had in his past. They weren't able to talk about his corruption issues. So Bernie has always said he likes Joe Biden personally. He doesn't regard him as corrupt, and he regards him as not only the better choice clearly over Donald Trump, but also somebody who could be electable. So I think that what the Democratic establishment did is completely in character with how Democratic establishments behave. And I think what Bernie has done in not just endorsing Biden, but also now in scorning his former campaign aides who haven't yet gotten behind Biden, as he did today in an interview, saying they were irresponsible for not getting behind Biden, I think is also unsurprising. Bernie was always an imperfect vessel, like all political leaders are, for the movement that coalesced around him. I think he's a good person. I think when it comes to the Congress, he's one of the best people in the Congress in terms of his ideology and character. But I think that who Bernie is what we're now seeing, which is by and large a loyal Democrat who likes the Democratic Party establishment. Let's see. There are some other questions here. Are you for Trump? That's a moronic question. I'm not for Trump. I'm simply appalled at Joe Biden's ideology, his 50 years of being a militarist and a corporatist, and I don't see what good would be established, especially now, without any concessions, by getting behind him, cheering for him, clapping and applauding for him as though he's some kind of inspiring leader, as opposed to what he really is, which is a rotted, corrupted, in my view, cognitively declining corporatist and militarist. He's devoted his whole career to defending corporations, defending imperialism, defending militarism, and I have no reason to believe he'll do anything different. Do you think pushing for either Bernie or Warren as a vice president is a path worth pursuing? I don't think Bernie's a possibility. I think Biden has made it unequivocally clear that he intends, as a promise, to name a woman as his vice president. I don't think he feels that he has any latitude to do otherwise, which would eliminate Bernie. Everything I saw from Elizabeth Warren in this campaign leads me to believe that she is a member of good standing of the Democratic establishment. I do think she purposely tried to sabotage Bernie's chances. She, remember, long after it was clear that she had no chance to win, insisted on staying in the race, dividing the left-wing and progressive vote, which is her right to do, but it's revealing about her intentions. Being fueled by a dark money anonymous donor, one single donor who gave $14.5 million to her campaign to enable her to continue. So I don't think she has ever expressed any inclination to empower or support left-wing populism over the last year. I suppose she's slightly preferable to the other more establishment candidates being discussed as viable vice presidential nominees, like Amy Klobuchar or Kamala Harris, or perhaps Stacey Abrams, but I don't think she would be anything near what the left ought to need to get behind that ticket. What do I think of the slaughterhouse closing today? I think, and I did a show on this last week, I interviewed Cassie King, who was the investigator and activist with Direct Action Everywhere, who has been inside factory farms in the US. And there's actually a really good article yesterday from National Review by a longtime animal rights activist about the fact that we are very good at mocking and deriding and expressing revulsion towards agricultural practices in China, towards wet markets, blaming them for viruses that leap from animals to humans, of which COVID-19 may be an example, but there have been many others over the past several decades, very scary pathogens that have leapt from animals into the human species. clearly animal agriculture is unsustainable ethically and morally, but also as a matter of public health and as a matter of our environment. The sludge and the disease and the pathogens are dumped into our communities. They're dumped into our bloodstream when we consume meat products because of the ways in which animals are tortured. There are antibiotic resistant bacteria being cultivated in these factory farms that are really scary if you get an infection and then that infection is resistant to antibiotics because of how many antibiotics this industry uses in their animals, simply to keep them healthy enough to make them fat and then slaughter them in order to maximize their profits. Animal agriculture, factory farms are an extreme celebration. How do I respond to Bernie supporters who can't see that Biden is a sparkly Band-Aid when what we need is invasive surgery? I think the argument that's being mounted is one that if you want to persuade other leftists not to vote for Biden, you have to formulate a persuasive, coherent answer to, which is that obviously, in their view, no matter what Biden is, he's incrementally preferable to Donald Trump. And the person who has made this argument for many years is Noam Chomsky, which is that when you have even an incrementally preferable person with that much power as the president wields, it benefits hundreds of millions of people in ways that you're not morally permitted to ignore. And I think that one of the most important components missing from that formula is the fact that when you rally behind an establishment candidate, a neoliberal, a corporatist, a militarist like Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, on the grounds that you're incrementally improving the situation, really what you're doing, first of all, I question whether or not it is an incremental improvement on a huge array of issues that have cataclysmic effects on the lives of not just hundreds of millions of people in the US, but billions of people on the planet. But even if you accept that premise, there are also consequences to constantly rallying behind and empowering and strengthening the neoliberal corporatist wing of the Democratic Party. There's a really amazing video from Lawrence O'Donnell before he started being paid millions of dollars a year by Comcast to host an MSNBC show and feed Democratic Party partisans what they want to hear, in which he says, look, I worked within the Democratic Party, and what I can tell you is that if you're on the left and you keep pledging your unconditional support to the Democratic Party leaders on the grounds that, well, they're not what I wanted, but they're kind of better than the Republicans, what you're doing is ensuring that they're always going to ignore you. Why would anyone pay attention to somebody who pledges their unconditional support all the time? And I think there are not just short-term, but mid-term populism, which increasingly is an outsider movement, very much at odds with establishment Democratic politics. It used to be that the left looked at establishment liberals as kind of wayward friends who just needed a little pushing, a little nudging, a little cajoling in order to be more on our side or closer to that movement. I think now neoliberalism and the perpetuation of a globalist neoliberal order, as obviously Obama and Clinton and now Biden are devoted to doing, is not just marginally different than left-wing populism. In many ways, it's the antithesis of it, such that strengthening it and rallying behind it and fortifying it isn't just not getting what you want, it's empowering things that you actively oppose. And I think people need to think long and hard about whether they want to do that. Let's see. How can a third party like the Greens make a presidential run? I don't think that, given the structure of the Green Party right now and the way our politics functions, that the Green Party can mount a credible challenge to the two major parties. I wish that weren't the case, but I believe that that is the case, which isn't to say that voting for the Green Party, whether you're in an all blue state or even a swing state, doesn't have value, but I don't think it's a viable alternative right now. Kamala will probably be the pick, though I prefer Warren, says somebody in chat. And I actually agree with that. If I were Biden, I would probably pick Kamala. I think she's very skilled in debating. I think she's extremely aggressive and effective in her attacks. I think she's a good politician. Maybe if you're a consultant, you'd want to pick somebody like Klobuchar, somebody from a swing state. I don't really think much about those kind of consulting questions, but if I were Biden, I'd probably pick Kamala, but I think he's going to pick some centrist like that. Let's see. Condi Rice is a good match for Biden, Republican AF, black and female, woohoo. I actually think that one of the overlooked stories is the way in which the establishment wing of the Democratic Party has essentially reunited with large swaths of the Republican Party. Obama himself often just said that he would be an Eisenhower Republican if it were the 1950s or 1960s. And you obviously see neocons who have migrated back to the Democratic Party. The Democrats' favorite pundits are people like Nicole Wallace, the Bush-Cheney White House communications director from the mid-2000s, Bill Kristol, the Bush-Cheney speechwriter David Frum, GOP operatives like Rick Wilson. I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think that happened because any of them changed. Obviously, they're opposed to Trump because Trump displaced their career opportunities. But ideologically, the Democrats and the neocons and the Republican wing of Condi Rice and people like that, kind of more sober, less ideological, but very militaristic, are very much in sync. I'd say much more so than Democrats are with left-wing populism. They're not just in bed as a marriage of convenience. They're in bed because they agree with one another on what they made the big issues of the day, like how to challenge Russia, how to challenge China, the need to do humanitarian interventions, acting in support of corporate and oligarchical sectors, and then throwing enough crumbs to working class and poor people to keep them placated and appeased, but never really radically restructuring our economy in any way that would be enduring. So I think Condi Rice would fit in very well into the modern day Democratic Party for the same reason that Bill Kristol and David Frum and Nicole Wallace and Rick Wilson and the Bush-Cheney GOP operatives of the mid-2000s fit very well into the Democratic Party as well. Tulsi for VP, that's never going to happen for a lot of reasons that we can discuss. I'm not saying it shouldn't, I'm just saying it won't. Isn't Bernie actually pragmatically trying whatever he thinks is capable of, knowing that the owners are in full and deliberate control of brutal two-party system? That's a very generous interpretation of what Senator Sanders is doing. I believe that Senator Sanders is genuine in his convictions about his political principles. But I also believe that if you look at, say, videos of Bernie Sanders when he was the mayor of Burlington in the 1980s and even a kind of firebrand independent congressman into the 1990s, he was an independent for a reason. His reason was that he didn't want to identify as a Democrat. Think about that, about how powerful of a statement that is. And though he's still nominally an independent, I think he very much identifies as a Democrat in every way other than his name, which is why I think he's also being very genuine when he says that it's urgent that we elect Joe Biden, the architect of the prison state, the lifelong defender of banks and credit card companies from Delaware, one of the prime movers in the Senate of the Iraq War, somebody who has been opposed to every policy of left-wing populism that Bernie said he was leading a revolution to sweep in. But I think Bernie is genuine about the strategic calculus. But I think that strategic calculus comes from being in Washington for decades, being inside the halls of power in the Senate, sitting next to Joe Biden. Remember, Biden was his coworker in the Senate, his colleague, and he regards those people as his friends, not as his enemies and adversaries. And I think that's the kind of politics that we're now seeing manifest. Someone pointed out that Warren's dark money donor gave to Joe Apoyo. That's true. The rabidly anti-immigrant and xenophobic sheriff in Arizona, but I believe she did that not because she supported him, but because they had assessed that he would be the weakest Republican nominee against the Democratic senator who she was supporting, and gave money to him for that reason. Did we offer Bri a job? I think Briahna is one of the single greatest and most exciting talents to emerge in politics in years. I adore her personally. I adore her politically and professionally. I think she's only going to get better and stronger. I was so proud that she came to The Intercept. We stole her from Current Affairs, more or less. She's returning to Current Affairs, but only because that was where she started. But we're talking to Briahna about doing a lot of different things, and I very much hope that she will be my colleague at some point again in the future in some way, shape, or form. But there are a lot of people who want to work with Briahna. Glenn, is it true that you changed your views on immigration because you discovered you were an immigrant yourself from the planet Krypton? That is untrue. Though I do think I do want to just take this opportunity to talk a little bit about some of those early articles that I wrote in 2005 because they're so misunderstood. When I started the blog in 2005, I did so with the primary intention of writing about what I knew at the time, which was as a constitutional lawyer, I wanted to warn about the excesses of Bush-Cheney executive power theories, the Article 2 theory that the president basically had the power to do anything in the name of stopping terrorism, including breaking the law, detaining people without charges, including American citizens, kidnapping them off the street as part of the rendition program, putting them in CIA black sites. And when I started my blog, I had no readers. I just kind of had this blog in front of me, and I was playing around with it a lot and sort of having debates with myself because I hadn't been paying much attention to politics for the prior 10 or 15 years. I had been working on my law practice, building my law firm, kind of ignoring politics, which seemed very small and trivial in the 90s with Clinton and the Lewinsky scandal and things of that nature. So I wanted to kind of start from scratch and figure out what it is I really believe, not believed as a byproduct of just swallowing and ingesting the New York Times. So I was really having debates with myself about a lot of issues to try on different hats and see what I believed. And I know no one believes that now. You see an article by me in 2005 and you think it's what I just firmly believe, but there's a lot of articles that are in direct conflict with one another because it was really having a kind of devil's advocate debate with myself, including about immigration. The one thing I was always consistent on was that the war on terror, the obsession with Islamic radicalism was a grave threat to our constitutional freedoms, and the executive power theories of Bush and Cheney were very dangerous to American democracy. But anyway, that's just the nature of having some kind of public platform is people use whatever they can against you. And so they use those early blog posts against me. I've just accepted that that's inevitable. Wouldn't a Biden vote reinforce the narrative of the electable corporate centrist? I think that whoever the Democratic Party nominee is has a very good chance of winning, especially given the coronavirus pandemic and the economic suffering that it's creating. By far, Trump's best prospect for winning re-election was the booming economy by some metrics for some people. And now he's lost even that. There's millions of new people unemployed. There's very little prospect that things are going to get radically better in the next 6 months. And I do not only worry that a Biden win will be interpreted by Democrats as proof and vindication that nominating corporate centrists is the way to win elections again, like they became convinced when Bill Clinton revolutionized Democratic politics from the politics of the working class to the politics of Wall Street and Silicon Valley. But also, I worry that it's a huge missed opportunity. I mean, if it's true that whoever the Democratic nominee is has a good chance of winning, I'm not saying they will win, I'm saying they have a good chance. It would be tragic to have had the opportunity to nominate someone like Bernie Sanders with a good chance of winning and instead pick some gray, mediocre, rotted, cognitively declining career militist and corporatist instead. But that's obviously what the Democrats are about to do because I think that is their ideology. Please address the red baiting of Democrats. I think it's a huge problem, and I think it's a major threat to national security and to world peace that a huge sector of the Democratic Party continues to believe that Russia is some sort of grave enemy, and not just a grave enemy of the United States, but a country that has seriously infiltrated and taken over our institutions in the tradition of Cold War paranoia. Most of them sound like Joseph McCarthy, and Edgar Hoover and William Buckley, and they continue to believe these deranged conspiracy theories that Vladimir Putin controls Donald Trump, as well as anybody who opposes the Democratic Party. They're really trained to just dismiss anyone who opposes the Democratic Party, whether from the left or the right, as being an agent and an infiltrator on behalf of Putin and the Kremlin. It's conspiratorial, paranoid politics that is extremely dangerous. It equates dissent with treason, and it really ratchets up the tension levels between the two most dangerous nuclear powers on the planet, which is the United States and Russia. And they continue to believe that it's a major problem within Democratic Party politics, that even after Robert Mueller's comprehensive report, which led to the arrest of not one person for criminally conspiring with the Russians regarding the 2016 election, not one American, these conspiracy theories continue to endure because it's in the interest of a lot of people that they do. Let's see, I'm trying to make my way. There's a lot of actually high quality questions here, which is making getting through these harder. I was told that a lot of times these chats are just trolls and very low quality outbursts, but I'm seeing some really interesting substantive questions, so I'm trying to pick and choose as best I can, and I apologize if I don't end up picking yours. How can you explain how Bernie being too cozy with the Dems made him less populist, given that the candidates who won votes from him are not at all populist? Well, I think the candidate who actually did the most damage to Bernie besides Biden was Pete Buttigieg. If you look at where Bernie suffered the most in 2020 as compared to 2016, it was from the loss of rural voters, which prevented him from winning Iowa decisively. He, at best, tied with Buttigieg. He came out with a couple of fewer delegates. Yes, there were a lot of shenanigans and a lot of extremely shady maneuvering that caused that, but no matter how you look at it, he didn't win Iowa decisively. And then he went to New Hampshire, which he blew out Clinton by, I think, 22 points in 2016, a neighboring state, and he barely won there as well. I think what you saw is a lot of migration from Bernie voters to Buttigieg voters, rural voters, independents, people who don't identify as hardcore partisans. And I think it's important to ask why. And I do think one of the reasons why is that Pete, contrary to popular perception, did engage in a lot of populist politics. He wasn't out there, for example, saying what Bernie was saying, which is Donald Trump is the most dangerous. Pete was saying the opposite. He was saying even prior to Trump, the status quo was terrible for people from my part of the country, meaning the Midwest. And if all we're doing is promising to uproot Trump and return to the status quo as it was prior to 2017, we're going to lose because the status quo was terrible for millions and millions of people in the industrial Midwest who voted for Trump or stayed at home and caused Trump to win the presidency. That, to me, is a populist message. That is an anti-partisan message. I think Pete is a fraud. I don't find him admirable in any way. I'm just talking about his political skills are very adeptly attuned to that kind of message that resonated with the voters that Bernie was winning by not appearing to be a standard Democratic partisan. I think Bernie became much more of a standard Democratic partisan in 2020 than he was in 2016, talking about impeachment, on board with Russiagate, talking about Trump is not a symptom the way Pete was, but a cause, the root of all evil, the thing that we have to uproot as our primary priority. And I think that's why a lot of voters that are in MSNBC Democrats ended up migrating away from Bernie. So I'm going to go down here. Do you think voter suppression, long lines, voting lines, ballot issues hurt Bernie? Voter suppression is a reality of American life. I'll just give you a little anecdote about that. I'm in Brazil, which is economically not nearly as wealthy or advanced as the United States. It's a wealthy country. It's the 7th largest economy in the world, but it has long been regarded as a developing country, not a modern, technologically advanced country like Western European nations, like South Korea and other Asian countries, and like the United States. And yet, this is how elections work here in Brazil. It's really extraordinary. Voting is mandatory. You get fined if you don't vote. You're allowed to vote none of the above or nobody or leave your ballot blank, but you're required to vote. Voting is held on Sunday, so nobody has to miss work, or very few people have to miss work in order to go vote. The voting closes, the polls close at, I believe, 7 at night, and by 9:15 or 9:30 at night, maximum, even in national elections, like in the presidential election of 2018, Brazil, which has a comparable population size to the United States, slightly less, I think it's about 220 million to 300 million in the US, all the results are fully counted in a legitimate and verified way 2 hours after the polls close. In the US, they're still counting ballots from the California primary and Super Tuesday primary, it takes weeks or not, if not months, to say nothing of 5 hour, 6 hour, 7 hour voting lines. It is a travesty, and it is very difficult to believe that it's anything other than intentional. And yes, I do believe that it ended up hurting Bernie for a lot of different reasons, including the fact that there were a lot of places where voter suppression was applied in 2016, deliberately targeted at his strongholds. But I don't think it's the reason he lost. I think that it's important not to repeat the pathologies of the 2016 Clinton campaign of refusing self-analysis and self-critique, and instead blaming everybody else for the failures. I think obviously there are a lot of external causes to why Bernie lost, but there are a lot of internal causes as well, and I think those are more profitable to think about. Glenn, when are you going to have Sam Harris on? I would be willing to dialogue with just about anybody. I think that ship has sailed, though. I think the personal animus on his part is so embittered and so entrenched that I don't think he would be either willing or capable of a constructive conversation. I say that about very, very few people. But I would certainly be willing to dialogue with just about anybody. Isn't it odd that Bernie didn't stay in until the 800 plus delegates primaries on June 2nd, when there have been no legitimate primaries in the pandemic era? Here's what I find odd about Bernie. If you're going to endorse Biden, which of course you are, why do it so early? Why not hold out the prospect of it in exchange for extracting concessions? Maybe Bernie extracted a few concessions, but if so, I just don't know what they are. And I think they ought to be public, and I think he should have given his movement an opportunity to vote more for him in a lot of states. And I think that he ought to have extracted those concessions in a public way, in a more substantive way. I think he owed that to his donors and to his supporters, who he promised a revolution, not an incremental erosion of certain policies. Just as an update, the interviews that I did today with Briahna, Joy Gray, and Ben Dixon about the Bernie campaign, the left Bernie supporters, and whether they should support the Biden campaign will go live in 7 minutes. So in 7 minutes, once that's up, I will end the live stream. And I really encourage you guys to go and listen to that, because Briahna and Ben are both amazing. And I found the discussion with each of them extremely thought-provoking and extremely thoughtful. Glenn, when will you release the Snowden files? I do want to just address this quickly, because I'm always amazed at how frequent and enduring this question is. We've released thousands and thousands and thousands of Snowden files. The idea was never that all the Snowden files were going to be released. If Edward Snowden wanted to release all the Snowden files, he could have just uploaded them all to the internet and done it himself. If he wanted to do that, he explicitly demanded that we not do that. He said, I want you, he gave it to us in Hong Kong, only to curate it and only publish the things that you can report responsibly. I don't want all of these files dumped. Some of them are not newsworthy. Some of them will endanger not U.S. soldiers, but the reputations of innocent people. There's so many instances in these documents where people at the NSA are speculating about whether someone's a terrorist, whether they are dangerous, how could we possibly justify publishing those documents and ruin people's reputations forever that way? There's so much in there that it would be unethical to publish. But what we did at the Intercept was we published thousands and thousands of articles. Much bigger news organizations that had this file, the Washington Post, the New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, News at ProPublica, stopped publishing years ago because it's very expensive to maintain the archive responsibly, to pay journalists and lawyers and editors to publish it. And after around 2016, nobody was reading these Snowden files any longer, but we felt a responsibility to the public to release as many as possible, and we spent millions and millions of dollars to do it until it just became financially untenable in this climate, and we were forced to lay off 4 people by our corporate parent, and it just became financially untenable to continue to spend millions of dollars publishing stories that nobody was reading any longer, virtually, that were really the last bits of tiny meat on the bone. Obviously, we spent 6 years publishing the stories we thought were the most significant and the most consequential, but it always amazes me that people look at The Intercept, which spent way more money and way more time and way more resources publishing Snowden files long after much bigger and better resource media outlets stopped because it was no longer cost effective for them to do it, and say, why haven't you released all the files? We've released 95% of the files that I believe are journalistically significant, if not more. Does Pierre own the files, or do you own the files you receive from Snowden? Yeah, that's an excellent question as well. It's another myth. The copies of the Snowden archive are in my possession and Laura Poitras's possession as individuals. They're not in Pierre Omidyar's. We lent a copy to The Intercept to allow The Intercept to publish stories, but we had full control over which stories got published and which ones don't. I have a full copy of the Snowden archive, as does Laura Poitras, and we're completely free to do with it whatever we want. Pierre Omidyar never exerted any control over the decisions about what to publish or not to publish, and he obviously can't prevent me and never has tried to prevent me and never would try if I wanted to publish a story on my own. But there was never a moment at The Intercept where I believed the Snowden files should be published, where The Intercept didn't want to. And if that ever did happen, I would have full freedom, as with Laura Poitras, to simply take the files and publish them with somebody else. Pierre doesn't have any kind of control over them. I think we're getting to the point where we're about to publish these interviews. Bree and Ben are both coming. It's actually, I'm being told it's going to be 2 minutes. So I'm going to end the live stream here. Depending on how things go, there's a possibility that I will come back on after those interviews are over, depending on what the activity in the chat room is. But I urge you all to go to The Intercept's YouTube channel. Go wait. It's just going to be up in about 90 seconds. And enjoy those two conversations that I had, because I really do believe both of them are very, very worth listening to on this question of whether the left should support Biden. Thank you guys very much. It was a great success. Lots of people watching. Questions were excellent, and I really enjoyed it. Good night, everybody, and we'll definitely do this again.